Hello, I'm Philip Hughes. I'm the chair of the Maroondah Interfaith Network. This is a series of seminars about building community. Through the last 7 months, much of our community life has been suspended. We've not been able to meet even close members of our family face to face, or friends, let alone those who are involved in our religious communities. We are hopefully on the verge of coming out of this challenging period. The steps may be small, but they will happen. And it's time to think about how we will use our new freedom. Will we do things differently? Will we relate differently to the people around us? Will we construct or participate in community in different ways? Late last century, a number of scholars started using the language of social capital to talk about the strength of community life. A community with greater social capital has greater strength, and that strength is related to people's well-being. High social capital means less crime and greater happiness amongst the members of the community. It means lower levels of isolation and poor mental health. Bonds are the close relationships that we have with close friends and family members. They are the relationships we can go to and ask them if they would lend us some money for an emergency, or the people from whom we can seek help if we're really feeling down. These people usually interact with us in a variety of our activities. They share our lives and they know our story. The second dimension are bridges. These are the friends who are not necessarily close, but people we interact with, people we get on with. They include our colleagues at work, most of the people in our religious communities, the people we meet in our educational pursuits, in our clubs, at the gym, and so on. The third dimension are linkages. These are the institutions in our community that we need. The shops, the banks, the markets, the social service agencies, the government agencies, and so on. Each of them has their own protocols, their own ways of working, their own terminology. Our community is strong when these institutions serve us well, when they act in trustworthy ways, when we have the knowledge and ability to use their services. One of the concerns that sort of led to this topic was some work that I was doing in terms of looking at trust and confidence in Australia's religious organisations. Now, there needs to be trust and confidence in Australia's religious organisations if we're able to participate in our communities and actually contribute to healing and to peace and generally sort of contribute to the society. The data from the Australian Survey of Social Attitudes, which is conducted every year by the Australian National University, the 2018 version was on religion, and it shows that the levels of confidence in religious organisations have fallen to the lowest time at any point since that has been measured. Just 11% of Australian adults said they have much confidence in the churches and in religious organisations. And I've graphed that here, compared with some of the other institutions. Generally, churches have a similar level of confidence to federal parliament. And in fact, the numbers who have much confidence in federal parliament is even lower. So churches, it's 11%, federal parliament, it's 7%. You can see the blue at the bottom, which is much confidence. However, if you add in the some confidence, then you've got 37% of the population with some or much confidence in the churches, and you've got 41% in the federal parliament. But then when you go to business and industry, if you add those two together, you're up to 72%, and legal system it's 61%, and education system it's up to 80%. So certainly the level of confidence in the churches is pretty low at this time. So we did some extra work to try and identify the factors. Is it just because people don't believe these days and don't have any interest in religion? And it's not just that. It's actually a feeling down here that churches have too much power. That they actually, a lot of people in Australian society feel that churches actually have too much power and too much influence in society, and feel that they're not necessarily using that for good. So certainly a lot of Australians, about 3/4 of all Australians, feel that religion brings conflict rather than peace. Now, what I've done here is to reverse that, to give us, to make this equation work. But basically what it means is a lot of Australians, those Australians who feel that religion actually does bring more peace rather than conflict, have a lot more confidence in the churches. Another issue is religion as a barrier to gender equality. Certainly there's a lot of people feel that religious organisations discriminate between males and females, and quite a few still only allow males into top leadership positions. So that's another matter for concern. What was interesting was that a lot of other things didn't make much difference. So whether you're rich or poor, whether you're born in Australia or overseas, what your marital status is, all of those things didn't really make much difference when you try to take these things into account. It's the attitudes towards religion itself which make the most difference. Now, one of the things that wasn't included in this survey was the issue of sexual abuse, which has occurred in the churches, and so that wasn't measured. But I think a little bit of that is reflected in the fact that this sense from a lot of people that the churches do have too much power. So moving on to the overall conclusions from that, this model is actually quite strong, that it predicts correctly about 84% of all the cases. And what then is very important is one's own religious belief. And belief is more important than whether you actually attend religious services or not. Issues can also have a major influence, particularly, as we've said, if religion is seen to contribute to conflict rather than peace, or peace rather than conflict, it is associated with higher levels of confidence. The gender equality issues and so on are the power issues. It's true that there's a general factor that some people are more confident in their institutions than others in general, but this turns out to be quite a minor factor, not a very significant factor. So those are the things which are having some influence on people. Well, the issue then is, how do churches and other religious organisations increase their confidence levels? And certainly if more people joined religious organisations, probably the confidence levels would increase. On the other hand, certainly for the churches, and I can't speak here for other organisations at all, but certainly for the churches, I think there's a need in many places to get their own house in order, as it were, to stop giving offence to the public through gender inequality in their leadership and in other ways. I think it's important for all our religious institutions to be seen to be working for peace and harmony and condemning violence and dissensions and factions, and using whatever power that we have carefully for the benefit of the vulnerable and those whom the churches serve. And certainly for Christians, I think this comes back to the important instructions from the sort of Jesus himself, that anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and servant of all.
Okay, I'm not actually going to be talking about my doctoral work, but I'm going to be talking about some measures of confidence of Catholics in Australia at the present time, confidence in their own church. And it's probably not surprising to let you know that those confidence levels are at a pretty low level. I want to show you some survey results. In previous talks, I've mentioned the National Church Life Survey, but I want to share some results from the National Church Life Survey. Some of you regardless of whether if you're from a Catholic or a Protestant or an Anglican tradition, you may have participated in a National Church Life Survey in your own congregation. It's a 5-yearly event which happens again in 2021, and it surveys hundreds of thousands of Australian church attenders from more than 20 denominations. I'm going to show you just some results from a Catholic, some questions of the Royal Commission that took place between 2013 and 17 into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. And that was a really shocking thing, and it was as shocking for Catholics as for anyone else, perhaps most of all for Catholics, because during the course of that commission, 4,445 individuals alleged that abuse had taken place within a church organisation, a Catholic church organisation, in the 60-year period from 1950 to 2010. That was something that made Catholics, especially the more committed ones, very angry, disappointed, disillusioned. Some walked away. We asked in the National Church Life Survey, we asked some questions about that. And so these are questions that we asked Catholics who go to Mass on a Sunday. We know they go to Mass on a Sunday because they were at Mass when they answered these questions. Do you agree or disagree with these statements? The cases of sexual abuse by priests and religious have damaged my confidence in church authorities. By religious, we mean religious sisters and brothers. My respect for priests and religious has greatly declined as a result of these offences. The response of church authority to these incidents have been inadequate and shows a complete failure of responsibility. And the last one says, it's covered up in my screen, I need to move something, here we go. Church authorities can be trusted when they speak about child sexual abuse. Well, let's look at some results of those. Firstly, a little bit about the National Church Life Survey. It was conducted in late 2016. We had a national random sample of Catholic parishes, 191 of them, resulting in 37,500 or nearly 37,500 responses. We had a whole lot of different questionnaires so that not everybody answered the same set of questions. We had a questionnaire called S3, and that had 2,591 responses, and that's the version that contains these questions that I've just showed you. That particular version of the questionnaire only went to Catholic parishes. And then, because this is a national random sample, I can confidently say to you that the results for these 2,591 people are representative of Mass attenders throughout Australia in the Catholic Church, of which there's over 600,000 every weekend. So let's look at the results of those questions. The cases of sexual, and I'll do this very quickly, the cases of sexual abuse by priests and religious have damaged my confidence in church authorities. Well, the top two lines show that 58% either strongly agree or agree with that statement. Their confidence has been shaken by these events and the news of these events. My respect for priests and religious has greatly declined. Well, not quite so much. Less than half, if you add the 24 and 12 that agree with that statement. And that's because I think people in churches are making a distinction between the church authorities that are up there somewhere, the bishops and others, as against their own parish clergy that they happen to know and love and respect, and most likely more than 90% of priests have not ever done anything like this. So then there's the next one. The response of church authorities has been inadequate and shows a complete failure of responsibility. Again, over 50% agree with that statement. In fact, 30 and 36, that's 65%. 65%, that's nearly 2/3, agree that the church's authorities have been, their response has been inadequate. And then last one, well, having said all this, can you trust a church authority when he, and I say he, when he speaks about child sexual abuse? And only 43% are prepared to trust a Catholic Church spokesman when he's talking about sexual abuse. That's a pretty low level of trust, and I would call it a huge trust deficit on the part of the Catholic Church. So this is the situation that the Catholic Church is facing at the moment in relation to one particular issue, but it's an enormous issue. It's interesting to note that not all Catholics think the same. Of course they don't. And what changes quite a bit is depending on the birthplace of the person, the country of birth. So this is just those last two questions. The second last question was about the inadequacy of the response. And the higher the figure here shows the more dissatisfaction. So people, Catholic Church attenders at Mass in Australia who were born in Britain and in Ireland had the highest level of dissatisfaction. People born in New Zealand and Vietnam have the lowest level of dissatisfaction. But notice that pretty well everybody is over half, over 50% of being dissatisfied and saying that the church has got response being inadequate and showed a failure of responsibility. What about that other last question? Can church authorities be trusted when they speak about child sexual abuse? Well, this time it's the other direction. The smaller the number shows the smaller percentage of people being prepared to trust their authorities. Australia's pretty low, New Zealand's low, Britain's low again, and so is Ireland. Pacific Islands people are more trusting of the church's authorities. 3/4 of them are still prepared to trust what the church authorities are saying, even when they're talking about child sexual abuse. We could explore those figures at length, but we haven't got time for that. So what happens when your people lack confidence and trust in the authorities? Firstly, mass attendance goes down. It's been going down for several generations now, since the 1950s, when perhaps 75% of Catholics went to church on a Sunday. Now it's down to about 11%. We'll do another measure in 2021, this year, so we'll see what's happened as a continuing part of decline, and also to see what impact COVID's having. I expect it will be enormous. And then we also get a falling Catholic population. Look at this. Every census since Australia's Commonwealth Federation began in 1901. We had a census in 1911, and every time except the last time, the Catholic population's gone up. And then it fell in the last 5 years between 2011 and 2016. Why is that? Well, I think it's because people stopped calling themselves Catholic. They still answered the census, but they decided that time had come not to identify themselves as Catholic anymore. They disidentified. And you can see what happened between 2001 and 2006, and then 2006, 2011, 2011, 2016. The numbers had an enormous drop between between the latter two censuses. The numbers went up enormously. And what we saw was in this right-hand column, those aged 35 to 74 disidentified in numbers never seen previously. It used to be if you got to 35 and you're still a Catholic, you were probably a Catholic for life. You're rusted on, as we say. But in between 2011 and 2016, we had an increase of over 100,000 people in that age group saying, I'm giving up. I don't want to call myself a Catholic anymore. So what can the church do to repair this lack of confidence and trust? And I want you to talk about that and give me some ideas, because I think it's another hard road that the church has got in front of it. Let's just stop sharing there for a moment. And I think what we can say is that the church needs to change its attitudes, its approach to people. We often talk about the church authorities being more transparent, being better able to listen to the experience of people, not to approach dialogue from the point of view that, oh, we already know all the answers, to actually have true humility. Pope Francis talks a lot about clericalism and the need to rid the church of clericalism, which is the idea that the clerical caste, or that priests have all the answers and must be respected regardless of their competence or lack of competence. It must not be assumed that clergy are incapable of committing crimes and doing the wrong thing. We've seen it in Australia. It's a very obvious thing that thousands, actually, far and away too many, Catholic priests did commit crimes between 1950 and 2010. And of course, before and after that as well. But that was the time frame in which the Royal Commission was looking. So how will the church have an opportunity to address this? Well, because they have called a plenary council that will be held later this year in October. It was supposed to be held last October. They put it off. Somebody thought it might not be a good idea to have it during the pandemic. So all of the things I've just addressed, both the problems and the possible attempts to repair a situation, can be addressed in this plenary council, which will be made up of bishops and others, and it has the authority to make substantial changes to the Catholic Church in Australia. The question now is, will the bishops only get the 1 point for setting it up, or will they continue to get some more points for making sure that it works effectively and brings about real and significant change?
Thank you, Dr. Bob. That was the statistics are a little bit alarming, aren't they?
They are, yes.
Let's hope the plenary council gets on the job there. Our next speaker, Fleur Creed, you're a PhD candidate for the Alpha Crucis College, and the topic of your thesis is the factors that enable Australian churches to build social capital effectively in their local communities and the nature of that social capital.
Okay, well, I'm just going to talk. I'm not going to show you a lot of slides and numbers. I'm going to talk to you about how local churches and religious communities can actually build some trust in the local community, in local society. One thing I want to actually say is that we're already doing that very well in a group like this by basically just mixing with other people who are different from ourselves. Now, there's a term that I know in some of our social capital talks before, we've talked about Robert Putnam, who is the social capital guru. There's a term that he coined, the Aunt Susan principle. And what the Aunt Susan principle is it's saying that we all probably have someone in our family who is a really good person, a really good, kind, wonderful person, but who doesn't have the same faith belief as us. They probably are really, really good, but we can't really say with our religious beliefs as they are that they're going to heaven or whatever we believe, because they don't believe what we believe. So how do we justify that? Well, the way around that is we mix with other people not like ourselves, and we start to develop tolerance and understanding for people unlike ourselves. Now, here we are all together, people of different faith beliefs, coming to understand and accept each other. So that's what we need to do. We need to not be in our little holy huddles and expecting the rest of society to think we're wonderful. So in a totally non-academic way, that's what we really need to be doing out there. Now, my research, and forgive me, Philip, for not doing a lovely academic talk for you. Philip is my principal supervisor. But what I want to talk to you about is what we really need to do. So the sort of things that we need to be doing is actually getting out there and showing the community that we are not weirdos. We are not total crazy lunatic weirdos, that we are good people and we're doing things in the community. Now, I have in my research surveyed, I was studying Christian churches, but across different denominations. So I sort of looked across the spectrum from very traditional churches to Pentecostal churches, so they ran the gamut. But obviously a lot of them do social welfare activities. That's one of the most common ways that we can engage with the community and build trust. But there's very common things like having food for the homeless, shelters. Look, the NCLS research has a lot of wonderful things, and they're things that a lot of different faith communities do too. I mean, we saw during the pandemic that some Sikh people had been making meals for homeless people. Lots of religions do it. But there are other things too. There are groups, they call them missional communities or convictional communities, whatever, where people go and live in different disadvantaged communities, and they're better able to actually understand the way people are and what they're going through because they actually immerse themselves in it. They might go and live in an inner city, things like the Wayside Chapel in Sydney. You know, we've heard about how people, but they go and live there. They go and live and they help prostitutes and people like this and drug addicts because they live there with them. They don't sort of come in from some beautiful house out in the suburbs and come in and help these poor people. They actually live there with them. There's other things we can do, mentoring programs, things like this. But we're actually doing something real where we're engaging with people. We're not just giving them money. That's not going to build trust. We need to actually face-to-face with people, really do something face-to-face. One of the things that I've found is actually a really great relationship builder with other people. Food, over food. I don't mean just handing them a packet of food. Sit down and eat with people. Eating with people is a great way of building relationship. You talk over food. It's really important. There's something that a fellow called Oldenburg described, third places. You know, we have our work, we have our home. Third places are other places where we come together with people. Some churches that I've seen have things like they've got a church gymnasium or something that's open to the public. So church people go there and people from the community go there. Other churches have cafes. The church people eat there and people from the community eat there as well. You might have some other ideas. I have no idea. You could think of anything, even to some degree craft groups, community gardens or other things like this. One of the churches I researched in Melbourne, it's a big one, not too far from you guys, they have a community garden. They have quite a big Asian congregation in their church. They have a community garden, and obviously a lot of the Asian people in the church know a lot about gardening. So they actually teach some of the Australians how to grow the vegetables that they know how to grow. And what they grow in the community garden, they have like a little cafe at the church. So they use the vegetables and herbs and things that they grow in the garden, in the cafe at the church. So there's sort of things that you can do to actually get people involved that is with the community, not just charity. Charity is not a great community builder, really. I mean, it's great for helping people, but it's not really building community. There's a lot of other, obviously things like men's sheds and stuff like that, but you want to try and build relationship where you're not, as I say, time and time again, not just delivering charity, but more building relationship where people are more equitable. Another thing is leadership. I know, Bob, you found this in your research as well, but when we talk about leadership, one of the important things is that the leaders in the religious group have a lot of connections in the local community. One of the churches I know, the pastor, whatever, was also a chaplain to the emergency services. Sorry, that's my dog wanting to join me. The pastor, sorry, she's a groodle. The pastor actually was the emergency services chaplain, and when there was flooding in that area, that pastor was able to also get the church motivated to do things to help coordinate stuff in that area. He was up in Townsville, and so he was a great coordinator because he was also the emergency services chaplain. So if your leadership is well connected in the community as well as being connected to other religious groups, that can be of great benefit to actually reaching out. Some of the others, obviously, if you've got some other connection with just, getting to know like your local politicians is a really good idea, because then they'll tell you if they've got a need. They'll let you know. One of the churches I researched, they have a very good relationship with their local members, and so they help a lot do things for the unemployed in the community. And whenever funding comes up for something, they just contact that church straight away and let them know. And they just do lots of stuff for the local community. And I think we've mentioned servant leadership. I think, Bob, that was one of the things that I found, that most of the leaders, when I look at traditional leadership styles, a lot of the leaders were really servant leaders. They put themselves out to do things. A lot of the people in their churches got involved because their leaders were doing it first. They weren't standing up the front saying, there were a few, don't get me wrong, there were a few who were very good at telling everybody what to do but didn't do it. But a lot of one of my case studies, they were a homeless centre. They did hot meals, whatever, but they also, I know you can't necessarily do it in Melbourne, but they opened their church up at night for the homeless to sleep there. Now, they had a real problem getting volunteers to watch the people at night. Well, the pastor was the one who watched the people at night. He was the one who stayed there. And that is really servant leadership. He was the one who did it. He saw the need. He couldn't get volunteers. He did it himself. So he always had plenty. He had people who'd volunteered there for 30 years, as long as they'd been doing it. They were volunteering. It's also good, and I know a lot of people have religious beliefs that they want their programs to be only run by their own denomination. They only want their volunteers doing it. But it's great if you can get community volunteers alongside as well, because working together, the volunteers build great relationships together. It's another great way of them knowing that you're not weirdos if you work alongside each other. That's really helpful. But there are some keys that I've found that are the key characteristics that help build those relationships. It's time. It's over time. Obviously, it's over time. It's time spent together, so not just 5 minutes, but it's also length, it's duration. You know, one of the craft groups I looked at had been running for years. One of the homeless centres, it was a group, and this is a not a multi-faith, but a multi-denominational thing. In one of the regional centres, there were 4 different Christian denominations: the Roman Catholic, Anglican, Baptist, and Uniting. In this region, all the churches, their numbers had reduced and the people were getting older. They got together and had this homeless, making homeless lunches for the homeless and whatever, and this centre. And they've been running since 1999. They got together to do this, but some of the volunteers have been there that long, and two of the clergy have been in their roles for that long. But the relationships that have been built, you know, a lot of the people in that town refer to this homeless centre as the church. They'll say, oh, you know, when people come into Centrelink, they'll say, oh, are you going up to the church now? It's the homeless shelter, but they see it as the church. And when something happens to one of those homeless people, they take over and they look after the families. They look after a funeral. They look after what it is. That is the church. You know, it's not anyway. Sorry, 2 more points. Another thing is what they call multiplexity. So it's having different things where you see people in different circumstances. So not just one thing. So don't just see them once for something, but you know, if one of what it really means, and one of my churches does very well, is that they have a few different things. They might see, they do have a counselling service, which is really good. A few of the churches do have counselling services if you've got the ability to do that. But they also have small things. So they might have like some small groups, a craft group. They might have courses. Courses are very good because then you can have people from your own group, your own church, whatever, but also people from outside who might come to do a budgeting course, a cooking course. Cooking courses are great, parenting courses or other things like that. People from inside and people from outside, and they bond together over whatever it is. Parenting is great, but also even things to do with children. If you've got whatever those MOPs or whatever those groups for toddlers, get together the parents and the children from outside and inside. And that's a small group of people with similar situations or experiences, but then have something where you have a lot of people from different backgrounds. A meal, you could have whatever it is, because then getting people together who are different, that's another different experience. You might have a big you might have an international food day or something that promotes getting different. Once again, food, lots of things with food. And the last thing that is a good idea, you've got to think about, because this is an important thing about this, is space and place. The informal, the flatter structures, like I say, the hierarchical thing is not so good. So if you can organise things where there's lots of free interaction, I know this homeless thing I was speaking about with the 4 different denominations, they took over one of the church's parish hall, but they had it remodelled so it wasn't all these separate little offices and things. They took out a lot of the walls that was open door policies, and so people weren't, you know, you didn't have all this making appointments to see everybody and calling people by their first names and letting people, so people can build trust by not feeling that this one is much more powerful and this, you know, very much more friendly and open, and, you know, that we're not strange and weird, and also, of course, that you're accessible. I mean, if you have your church or your whatever it is, temple, located out somewhere a million miles out of town, they are going to think that you're strange. How do you interact if you're separate? You need to make yourself part of the community.
Thank you very much. Ven Chang Ji, I'll go through this impressive description of you, and as I say, many people know you, but it should be wisely advised as to just what your standing is. Mahayana tradition Buddhist from Dharma Drum Mountain tradition. In your role in international affairs as special assistant to the late Venerable Master Ven Chang Ji, you were a representative to the United Nations, participated in organised side events, including the participation of youth and multi-faith religious leaders.
I'm thrilled to be part of this series and then to be back with you all. Good to see old friends, new friends. Here we are in February of 2021, and the pandemic is still very much alive. Countries are still in lockdown. People are still engaging in physical distancing. So I'm going to take a different approach to this topic. There was a lot of talk about lack of confidence with faith groups, but I would like to present the fact that actually the lack of confidence with faith groups is really not the greatest issue that confronts us. It's actually a symptom of the greatest crisis that confronts us. And what is this crisis then? So this greatest crisis that confronts us is actually the separation and isolation that we have bought into. So I'm going to present it from this point of view. So how do we use this crisis? You know, the crisis of the pandemic, the crisis of climate change, the crisis of poverty, racism, and, you know, the various kinds of abuses that Bob was bringing up as an opportunity for human renewal, right? So while it's crucial to strengthen our activism around issues like climate chaos, this global pandemic, racial injustice, authoritarianism, and various forms of abuses like gender abuse, LGBTQ prejudices, so on and so forth. But we need to actually marry our activism with grounded spirituality and robust practices that supports awakeness and discernment. And more importantly, that actually creates islands of sanity in an insane world. So many things happening. So the question that we're left with in reframing this myriad seas of crisis and chaos is, the question is, what kind of new human being am I being asked to become? So many countries, if not most, possibly all, have bought into the beliefs and values of imperialism, racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. And this actually undermines our capacity to see each other as embodiments of love. It's killing the life support system of our planet, on which where all life depends. And this is a moment in which we are all being called to wake up and be transformed. And the statistics that Bob was giving was just alarming. So to admit that these systems and structures are actually destroying us and the planet. I like to bring to your attention that the prevailing worldview that we have, the prevailing worldview is that of fear and power and scarcity. And that worldview has a very powerful addictive quality because when we get fearful, we shrink. We don't believe we can change the world. We turn inward to protect ourselves as individuals, as a community, as a society, as a country. I have seen this from so many different levels. So in addition to this kind of worldview, competitive marketplace and capitalism buttress it. Because in that ethos, in that story, we're taught that if someone else gets ahead, you will not get ahead. So in other words, trade off, which is the principle of scarcity. So therefore, you need to maximize your own self-interest. So maximizing money and power without regard to the well-being of other people and for the planet are just the rational thing to do. However, this actually has resulted in people and the planet becoming dispensable. We are commodified. The planet is commodified. So sustaining our lives and sustaining the planet are completely contrary to this competitive marketplace. And it's contrary to the ethos of capitalism. Because if we want a sustainable world, if we want a world in which we, as human beings, and which animal life, plant life on the planet itself can survive and thrive, capitalism is not the economic system that will get us there. Because when we try to balance the needs of people, the planet, and profits, balance the needs of people, planet, and profits, profits always takes precedent. So we need to create an entirely new way of being and doing, one that is grounded in love, a new bottom line, where we measure our success and how we judge institutions' efficiency and productiveness, not by accepting that they maximize money, power, and profit, but our success and institutions' success is measured to the extent of how we maximize our capacity to be loving and caring, kind and generous, and the institution's success on their ability to build a socially, economically, and environmentally just and sustainable world. Imagine if institutions in our society measured their success that way, which includes faith-based organizations too, faith-based institutions. If we measure our success this way, So you have to understand these two divergent worldviews, that we have to move from the worldview of fear to the worldview of love. We have to help people. We have to help people understand this. We have to help people move from fear to love. Sadly, this split exists even in the spiritual religious traditions that claim to be about love, caring, kindness, and generosity. And some of these religious communities or institutions actually advanced ideas that are for domination and power and control. Now, going back to my work and my experiences in the UN. So UN is actually the most significant intergovernmental organization with a global public policy role. So over time, it has consolidated policymaking structures and processes with very strong secular preferences, which traditionally excludes religious concerns, or at best, regard them as marginal to the organization's policy. So recently, however, the UN increasingly accepts that faith-based organizations may have something useful to contribute on various issues. So here's a quote that I'd like to share with you from the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in a statement that he made in 2009. So he said, as a secular organization, the UN has no common religion, but like all major faiths, we too work on behalf of the disadvantaged and the vulnerable. I have long believed that when governments and civil society work toward a common goal, transformational change is possible. So Ban Ki-moon points to a common ground between the UN and major faiths, which is work on the behalf of disadvantaged and the vulnerable. So implying that religion has something to contribute in this regard. So Ban Ki-moon's comment also highlights that today's changed international environment provided faith-based organizations with a new or enhanced role in global public policy, and that centers around values. And it encourages a shift of the UN from an exclusively secular approach to dealing with problems to one which is informed by ideas deriving from religious values which are widely and universally accepted. So even the UN is realizing that you can't use a secular approach to resolving issues, that there are also values that could shift solutions, that could shift something within the process. But I have to remind you, the UN is not looking for preaching. They are a platform for working on behalf of the disadvantaged and the vulnerable. So that is the commonality in the context of working cross-discipline or cross-sectorially. So in my mind, one thing that the UN represents is the coming together of different communities that share a grounding in the earth. It's a bridge. In the previous session that we were talking about bridging, it's a bridge that affords the possibility for everyone in all expressions of life to belong. So why aren't bridges in the UN and our societies working better now? People do acknowledge the value of bridges, but instead of building bridges, we actually have been building walls, and we have been fracturing. So that separation, that isolation that I was talking about. So within the international community and the UN member states, different stakeholders spend a lot of time lobbying and convincing that theirs are the best solution and doing a lot of othering. So focusing on differences cannot help move the conversation forward as it polarizes and isolates. However, by focusing on unity in diversity, conversations can move forward in a positive way and even heal. So we want to stop the polarization, but how do we do that? One thing I would propose is bridging and conversation are one way. So bridging is basically a process in which we recognize another person's humanity. In South Africa, there's a Zulu word, sawubona, which means I see you, and a Bantu term, ubuntu, which means I am because you are. So in Buddhism, the concept of dependent co-arising, which means we recognize our deep interrelationship. When engaging in bridging and conversation, it's hard to have an authentic conversation with different stakeholders. So in the UN, or even with international communities, it's hard to have authentic conversations with different people, different groups, unless we can honor deep structural issues like colonization, income inequalities, social justice issues, prejudices, all these preconditions. You can't just whitewash them. These problems are inside and outside. And we have to actually be attentive to how these structures make bridging and also make the ability for us to see each other difficult. So I would say, start with short bridges. Start with things that are easier. Right? Fleur was talking about a lot of great examples of what some of the local churches were doing. Start with things that are easier. Start with things that are closer to home. Don't start with the most difficult. And bridging and conversation doesn't mean that we have to agree with someone. It's not predicated on the notion that I am going to convince you or you are going to convince me. It's actually predicated on seeing each other, on being present, on listening, and on compassion, which means to suffer together. Okay, well, I'm just going to conclude by saying that a couple of the most effective tools for us to heal the world and create a world in which we all belong is actually bridging and authentic conversations, right? But so creating this world, but belonging actually requires that we co-create, right? And co-creation requires agency, power, love, and responsibility. We are all responsible. So responsibility is different than guilt or blame. So we don't dwell on guilt or blame. We actually dwell on responsibility. All of us are responsible for creating and co-creating a world and a future where everyone belongs. And we all belong to the earth. And that's the challenge that I want to leave with you. So to be ambassadors for bridging and authentic conversation and creating a world where we all belong. Thank you.
Thank you, Chang Ji. that your previous presentation was brilliant. This one has got 2 ticks on it, double ticks, amazing stuff. To be talking about the embodiment of love is really the pinnacle